morning. Welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee, and we're very grateful to all the witnesses on the panel for coming down, I think all from Glasgow, to talk with us about the Safer Drug Consumption Room. And I hope we said it at the time, but thank you very much for arranging our visit and for the conversations we had afterwards. They were very useful to our inquiry. So I'll kick off with the first question, and I think that's to yourself, Saket. Could you tell us briefly a little bit about the evolution of the plans for the Thistle and what the main barriers were to its opening?
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation here, and it was great to see some of you at the Thistle a few weeks ago. Thanks for your interest. The Thistle is a result of about a decade's work. We became operational on the 13th of January, but the background to the Thistle is that that Glasgow City is for many years had a very high prevalence of problem drug use and a high rate of drug-related harms linked to that. We've had outbreaks of unusual issues and public health emergencies in the city, such as the Clostridium novae, anthrax, botulism in the population involved in injecting drugs. But it was really in about 2015 when we saw a sudden spike of new diagnoses of HIV in people who inject drugs in Glasgow City. And when we investigated that through a formal health needs assessment about people who inject drugs in public places, particularly in Glasgow city centre, because most of the new HIV diagnoses were linked to that population, we did a formal health needs analysis, which was commissioned by our Director of Public Health and by the Chair of the Alcohol and Drugs Partnership, called Taking Away the Chaos. And as well as describing some of the characteristics of the population and their health and care needs, it made a number of recommendations about changes in current provision of services at that time, but also the implementation of new services, new evidence-based services that had been effective in other parts of the world that could have an impact, on a positive impact for this population. And the two new interventions that were recommended were the implementation of a heroin-assisted treatment service, because many of the people who were involved in the HIV outbreak had many years of experience of multiple interventions and treatment and had not benefited from them. So the argument was, how about trying a new evidence-based intervention that had worked successfully elsewhere? We had the legal framework to deliver heroin-assisted treatment through the licensing processes from the Home Office and for licensing of prescribers as well. But the drug consumption room was another recommendation of that report. The drug consumption room at that time was described as a safer injecting facility. There are multiple such facilities across the world, and we've done a literature search and linked in with some of the other services across the world to learn from them. And the literature search gave us reasons to believe that such an intervention in Glasgow City would achieve the similar benefits that were achieved in other parts of the world. So particularly around providing a safer, more hygienic environment for the use of drugs, that if it was located in the right place, people would use the facility. By using the facility, there would be improved health outcomes for individuals, and those health outcomes would relate to bloodborne viruses as well. So reduced transmission of bloodborne viruses in the population, but improved other health outcomes as well, such as wounds, such as mental health, and wider, less emergencies. Of course, by being able to respond to overdoses and emergencies on site, there's also the benefit and likelihood of reduced drug-related deaths as well. But there were wider and links using these services have been shown in other parts of the world to support people into other treatment, care and support services as well, particularly drug treatment services. So, we presented then a business case to the Glasgow City IJB, and that business case included not just the benefits for the individuals that we wanted to engage in such a service, but also the businesses for the community around such a facility, because we were aware and had been aware for a number of decades of the impact of discarded drug-related litter and visible public injecting to residents, to businesses, to other stakeholders, even to members of the public coming through Glasgow city centre, and in many other parts of the world they've been shown these facilities to have a really positive effect on the social environment, the social amenity. And then finally, the final part of the business case was in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. They've been very sort of strong studies, particularly when we were looking at the literature in 2015-16. There was very good peer-reviewed journal publications from Canada and Australia in particular around the cost benefits, and the benefit is derived from this intervention preventing things like presentations to emergency departments, hospital admissions, less ambulance call-outs, and even the prevention of HIV, which was really important and remains an important discussion. A lifelong treatment for HIV can run into hundreds of thousands of pounds for one individual. They're very effective treatments, but they are very expensive, and I think at that time the cost we were given for lifelong treatment was £360,000 per individual, and the evidence base from across the world, that is, if you prevented even a few HIV infections a year and hospital admissions, then there was a very significant reduction in wider costs to the wider health and care services. So the IJB approved that business plan and asked us to then approach the Lord Advocate for the legal framework we would require. So the drug consumption rooms were not possible at that time without some legal framework, and we approached the Lord Advocate to ask for a statement of prosecution policy or prosecution waiver in order for us to run this service. And as you know, and is well documented, that was declined at the end of 2017. After that, there were a number of years of trying to find a legal solution to this, which we can get into in more detail. But as that was happening, the drug crisis in Glasgow and actually across Scotland was worsening and steeply worsening. And so the case for a drug consumption room became and remains as relevant and prescient as ever. We were, however, able to implement the heroin-assisted treatment service, which we did at Hunter Street Health and Care Centre, where you visited, and that was done at the end of 2019. We then were, prior to that, we hadn't yet identified a site for a co-located drug consumption room and a heroin-assisted treatment service. But once we implemented the heroin-assisted treatment, and the original business case was a co-located facility, it made sense to implement a drug consumption room on that site as well. It remained relevant in terms of its vicinity to well-known and well-established public injecting sites in the city. It remains close to where we know there are a number of people involved in injecting away from home. And it's also a community that's affected by drug-related litter and visible public injecting as well. So moving on then, we were delighted when the Lord Advocate, the new Lord Advocate, made a statement in Parliament, I think it was 2021, to say that she would consider a new and specific proposal, and we worked on that new and specific proposal under current legislation, so without legislation change, and so we presented those to to the Lord Advocate, and we were delighted when in September 2023 she was able to offer a statement of prosecution policy, after which we then went into an implementation plan that involved the building needing to be worked in order to deliver the injecting facilities and the area that you saw. And we embarked on an engagement plan with the community, as was stated in the Lord Advocate's letter to us, things that she would like to see as part of the implementation plan. And we developed a very sort of robust evaluation program, and I believe some of the research team have spoken to you already, given evidence already. So we spent a very intense year, as you know, on that implementation plan, and then we were delighted in January the 9th this year when a formal statement of prosecution policy was issued, which allowed us to be operational on the 13th of January. That, believe it or not, was a summary of 10 years.
It was a very good summary. And did anything change in your proposal between your original application to the Lord Advocate and the one that eventually was agreed?
Yeah, so in the original application, as I said, we hadn't identified a site specifically as such, and the latest proposal was a much more specific proposal in relation to site. We also included a number of other information and documents around how we would manage to avoid certain elements of the Misuse of Drugs Act breaches through our rules and our standard operating procedures. And we provided such document to give the Lord Advocate as much comfort as we could, so that our request was now just a specific request around possession of drugs for potential service users in the facility, and the site and nature of the facility was described in more detail.
So I suppose a two-pronged question. Have the positions of the Scottish and UK governments changed over time, and are those governments proactively engaging with you?
I'll just start off on that, but I'll defer to my colleagues as well, who may want to go into more detail. So my understanding is from the initial proposals and the approvals by the IJB, they were votes in the local council and local Scottish government to support these facilities, and that support has remained as far as I'm aware till now. As you know, there were asks of the UK government around primary legislation to alter elements of the Misuse of Drugs Act that would allow a facility like this to exist, both in Glasgow and potentially other places as well, or devolving the powers to do so to the Scottish Government. And I believe, so that was declined at that time, and my understanding is that position hasn't changed, but I'll hand over to Councillor Casey, and he may have more detail.
Thanks, and good morning, committee. So yeah, as Saket has said, we've had a strong cross-party consensus at Glasgow City Council regarding the introduction of a safe consumption room, which has been hugely helpful in that sense, and we reaffirmed our support when the Lord Advocate made the intention to release a statement of prosecution policy back in September 2023, and we got that cross-party support again at Glasgow City Council, which was really helpful. I think it's fair to say that the Scottish Government have been supportive of us introducing a safe consumption room from its inception and from the very early days, and actually have worked really closely with the team in Glasgow and obviously alongside the Lord Advocate's office as well, in terms of taking that those different cases through the journey. Scottish Government did obviously support us in the initial request to submit a proposal to the previous Lord Advocate. However, as we know, and has been explained earlier today, is that Lord Advocate had made and came to the conclusion that they would not be supportive of that. In terms of the UK government's position, I think it's fair to say that the previous UK government had been fairly hostile to us opening a safe consumption room in Glasgow, and had been actively, I suppose, proposing against us going down that road. I think it's fair to say their view was very much that there was no safe way to take drugs. That was their public position on it, and were less than helpful, I think, moving forward. Obviously, when we got the permissions to, or the statement of prosecution policy, or the intention of that, it was welcome that the UK Government and the Home Office had acknowledged the independence of the Lord Advocate in Scotland and that position. And they had intimated that while they didn't agree with opening a safe consumption room, they were not going to intervene, which as I say, was very welcome. And it was, I suppose, a bit of a shift in the right direction, but still they were not coming out in support. In terms of since we've opened, I'm not aware that the UK Government has formally changed that position, and I suppose the work of this committee and the discussions that we have in the coming months and your work will be hugely crucial, and hopefully in terms of developing that position in that case, because I do hope that the UK Government do sympathise with the work that we're doing and really look closely at it, because as we know, the way in which we've got the permissions just now through the Lord Advocate is not the easiest way, to say the least, to open safe drug consumption facilities. We've managed to do it in Glasgow, but we know that safe consumption rooms are needed, maybe more of them in Scotland and indeed across the UK as well, and we really need to find a better way and an easier way to do that. And for me, the best way to do that is a change to the Misuse of Drugs Act.
I would imagine the evaluation, which we'll come on to talk about later on, will also be crucial in that process. Okay, thank you for that. I'll pass over to Lynn now. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thank you for coming down today, and apologies for not making it to Glasgow the other week to see you all in person at the facility. Hopefully I'll get there soon. It's obviously very early days, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to draw any conclusions, and certainly in the last evidence session it was intimated to us that it would be some time before any conclusions will be able to be drawn. But in terms of effectiveness up till now, where do you think things are at in terms of footfall, in terms of the number of people using the facility? Is that in line with expectations that you had? Do you believe it's reflective of the number of people in the area who are using drugs? And just finally, in that context, there's obviously been significant discussion in and around the use of the facility by males and the use of the facility by females. Do you feel that's reflective of the community as it stands? And if not, what more work needs to be done to make sure that those who are perhaps not using the facility, who could be using it, are doing so in the future? I don't know. Who wants to go first?
I'll start.
Okay.
There's a lot in there, apologies.
No. So, the early days, so we're week 8 now, so it's very early days to draw any definitive conclusion. We will be issuing reports to the IJB and be able to go into more detail about our analysis of reach and effectiveness in due course. But the early experience is very positive and very promising. So to date, we've already been visited by over 140 unique individuals. We have had over 1,000 such visits. We have had this injecting space, the using space, used well over 700 times. So all of that means that we are making an inreach into that population that we hope to. That population is, some of that population definitely is feeling that this service is already meeting their needs. And we've prevented 700-800 drug-related litter being discarded in the streets. We find that people are engaging with the whole range of the service model, so it's not just the using space, but the wider service model seems to be at this early stage fit for purpose, in that people are using it as a touch base to go and engage with other treatment and care and support needs, such as wound care, such as housing, support, treatment and care as well. And crucially, we have already seen, as anticipated and as exists in all other drug consumption facilities a number of very significant medical emergencies and overdoses that have been reversed and people have been supported. And I'm fairly confident that some of those in particular, if they had happened behind closed doors or in a public space with other people not being in the vicinity, they would likely have had very tragic outcomes. So at this stage, I certainly feel, and we feel, quite positive about the experience to date. We have a lot more to do to improve the reach, increase the reach, and make people feel comfortable about returning for as many of the injecting episodes as possible into this facility. But Lynn is probably able to provide a bit more detail on some of the day-to-day experiences.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Saket's already spoken about the numbers, but I think more than the numbers is the care and treatment that people are receiving. So we're getting feedback from other services about people's experience within the service. So they're talking about being made to feel welcome, not feeling rushed, and it feels like a safe space to them. And to that end, what's happening is we're seeing new people coming in every day because they're speaking to other people that have used the service. So people are prepared to travel and come to the service to make use of it, which is much better than obviously being alone down a lane or whatever. The medical emergencies, we've managed most of those in-house. Very few have needed an ambulance. Very, very low numbers of people have needed an ambulance, but all of them have returned to the service after that. So the experience, while it's quite a traumatic experience for people, has not put them off coming back to the service. So they've felt they've been well looked after, and they're building good relationships with all the staff team within the service. I think that's quite key. There's been a lot of outreach happening with the staff team within the service, and we aim to keep that going. So we're actually being quite targeted in terms of our outreach. So we're going to places where there's a lot of public injecting and engaging in the local area and speaking to people about the service. And people are reporting when they come in that it's because they've spoken to some of our outreach staff. And again, working with partners to develop that outreach and get the word out there to people that actually this is a service where you can come, you can feel safe, you can have your needs addressed, be it wound care, be it your physical health, your mental health. You can get bloodborne virus testing and taking care of some of people's most basic needs. The shower facilities have been used daily, the clothing store has been used daily. So we're really making that wider difference to people. You know, yes, they can come in and inject, but that's almost a transaction while they're there. There's a huge amount of other work goes on. We've made a number of referrals to care and treatment services already, including one in the first week, which we didn't necessarily anticipate so early on. We've made lots of referrals to housing. The gender split we're seeing is roughly what we see in our care and treatment services. It's similar, but we are quite proactively trying to work at getting more women in, because we know that's a gap across our services. It's difficult for women to access services.
What do you think are the underlying causes for that in particular?
There's a real anxiety with women coming into a service. Sometimes it may be that they're in a relationship and their partner won't allow it. But there's an anxiety, there's a mistrust. And I think overall there's a mistrust of statutory services. We're aiming to overturn that and allow people to come in and get a different experience within the Thistle to one they'd get anywhere else. So we're doing some work with Roots Out, physically going out with the outreach team there, speaking to women involved in prostitution in the local area and trying to talk to them about what's going to make it easier. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to work with people, find out what's going to make it easier for women to come in. Same as working with Simon Community Hub, we've got strong relationships there, and it's just about going out, asking women what they want from a service and trying to make it as smooth and comfortable as possible. And again, the hook of having that shower, nice facilities, clean, dry clothes is really proven quite successful.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the crucial bits of the development and the design of the facility was the Women's Reference Group, who was a group of lived and living experience individuals who had obviously experience of the services that we provide. And actually, if you look at the early design and concept of what we had, it changed dramatically when we're speaking to that group to try and make sure it was as welcoming as possible to women who are obviously caught up in addiction. So I think that was a crucial part of designing the service. for those specific needs. My colleagues have also touched on, I suppose, the impact the facility is having on the individuals using it, but I think what is also crucial is the wider impact in terms of the local community as well, and that's something that I think we need to be really clear about. Part of the Lord Advocate's statement was about the kind of public engagement element of it, and doing a lot of that dedicated work to go and speak to the local community where the facility is. And unfortunately, I think over the last couple of weeks there has been an element of kind of deliberate misinformation in the public domain from various sectors who are, I suppose, trying to attribute the public injecting sites that we know, and there is evidence going back many years, are a new thing because of the safe consumption site. And I think we need to be very clear about the fact that these are not new. We're very well aware of them, and in fact the Thistle's location was partly due to those public injecting sites. But the reason I mention that is because if we're trying to demonstrate the benefits to the local community as well as those who are using the service. And I suppose anecdotally, when speaking to our cleansing operatives and feedback that we've been getting from the teams who regularly go and clean up these public injecting sites, is that anecdotally there's a bit of a reduction in those and the number of discarded needles and drug-related paraphernalia. Obviously, the academic study that's doing this and the evaluation will go into that in a lot more detail, because there's been a lot of mapping done pre the facility opening, and that will continue after that. But anecdotally, in terms of the feedback we're getting from service users, from the cleansing operatives, is that those numbers are reducing. So I think even these early days, in terms of the 8 weeks, that's 700 injections that would have been taking place in public places in the surrounding areas that have taken place away from that, and those numbers are reducing, which is really good as well.
Could I just briefly add to what my colleagues have said? So obviously, in terms of going back to the question around expectations, I think we would all say that the numbers that we are seeing, the numbers of people accessing the service so early on, has probably exceeded expectations. We know that as a population, you're talking about people who don't trust services a lot of the time, and really have been challenged to struggle, have been challenged to engage with services. So as Lynn mentioned, that outreach work is really important. But we have seen an increase week on week, and I think that's the bit that really pleases us in terms of the engagement. And I think another really important aspect of the service is that it has allowed for people to come in, not inject, spend a bit of time in the service, and then come back, and we've seen that fairly regularly. Do you know that people have came, visited a couple of times, and then have felt able to come back and use the injecting space. In terms of women as well, just again briefly, to pick up on Lynn's points, I think we know that women in addiction services overall, so treatment services, residential services, are very underrepresented. And that is about some of the barriers, that's about the stigma, that's about a male-dominated environment that we have, and we spoke to a number of facilities across the world about that, and actually nobody's managed to, get a solution for that. So as both Councillor Casey and Lynn have said, we've done a lot of work with women with lived experience and continue to do that work, but that the clothing store, the showers, for example, came specifically from that group of women who said if you want to engage with people, you need to offer something more, and probably a safer space away from even the injecting area and the lounge area that the service offers.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Just one very quick final point. You referenced IGB reports. How often are you reporting into the IGB?
We have now said 6 monthly.
Okay.
There has been a number of IGB reports leading up to the point of implementation, but 6 monthly.
Perfect, thanks.
I have two supplementaries from Aileen Stewart firstly.
Just picking up on what Allan said there about taking the local community alongside you. So when we spoke to you last week, the week before, you were due to have your first community meeting. So can you maybe just inform us how that went?
So I get the pleasure of chairing that meeting, so I think I'll kick off, but others, Lynn and Councillor Casey were there as well, so they can give their versions of events. It went very well. The attendance was good. We had community reps, but I think it's fair to say we could have more community representation in future meetings. We would like to have more business representation in the future meetings. So it was a first meeting, so we're establishing our terms of reference and our how we're going to do our work. What we also established was that, you know, evening meetings are difficult for some members of the community and perhaps for some businesses as well. So we're looking at different days of the week, different times of the day to try and engage people more. It was very interesting, though, that I think my perception was that we had very positive feedback from a number of stakeholders, particularly those who work with the patient population group who we want to use the service. And in fact, we had some good anecdotal reports of outcomes for individuals who had used the facility already. We would like to hear more about the community experience in due course.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's a fair point to say that there needs to be more representation from local community members specifically. I think that's really, really crucial. And I have to be really honest, that's not through lack of trying. We probably carried out one of the most extensive engagement pieces of work that the HSCP and IGB probably have ever done in terms of implementation of a service. We conducted numerous public engagement events, public drop-in, we went to public meetings, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of the local community, the vast majority of the public, have not engaged one way or the other. And it's obviously, I think that's just generally the case with consultations or engagement events. So it's really difficult to gauge public opinion on an issue like this. But I think it's fair to say that we will do a lot of work. We've got some key stakeholders and key community members who are involved in that, and they do let the local community know about the work that we're doing, and they do spread the word and pass the message on, and really thankful actually for the work that they do and the community members do, because actually they went above and beyond, and they've been really helpful in terms of spreading the information that sometimes it's really difficult for us to just get out there. It's word of mouth sometimes, but it's down to us to try and kind of I suppose make sure that we are getting the right people in the room and having those conversations. I think crucially that engagement forum, albeit Saket is chairing it just now and he's a fine chair, but the ambition is to transfer that chair and the running of that engagement forum to the local community so that they've got ownership of it and they can determine when the meetings will be, what's discussed there, what feedback is coming through, because really in terms of the best practice that we've seen across other consumption rooms across the world, that's a good bit of practice that they do, and it really drives the narrative and drives the discussions that we're having, because as much as we think we know what the community want to hear or whatever, or we think we know the issues that are coming up, if they're driving those discussions and feeding back to us, that's crucially important to get the information that we need.
I think as well it's really important to note the community members that are coming are not necessarily people who are highly supportive of the thistle. You know, so it's not we've handpicked people who are going to tell us what we want to hear. They very much challenge us. And I think that's really useful because it allows us to hear the reality and the impact of the service in the community, and we're very clear that we want to hear that. And as well as changing some of the times of the meetings, we're also changing the venue. We're just trying a number of things to make sure we can access as many people as possible.
One final point about this. So the meetings themselves are very important, but the communication exists out with those. The partnership working exists out with those. So, for example, when we started hearing of information and it turned out to be misinformation around what was happening around the sites, we were able to liaise with a number of relevant stakeholders in a partnership way to investigate and respond quickly, rather than, we don't wait for the meetings as such. We are constantly in conversation and responding to issues in a partnership approach.
Thank you. Alistair?
Thank you, Chair. The figures, to my mind, are very impressive. It's very encouraging for week 8, and thank you for allowing us and thank you for allowing me to visit last week. I found it extremely beneficial. One fact I took from the figures that we discussed last week and the figures before us today are that perhaps those who are using your facility are doing so maybe at this stage, at this initial stage, once a week, so effectively you can keep them safe and help them be safe when they're there. How do you increase their use? How do you encourage them to come along more frequently and keep them safe every day rather than just perhaps once every 7th or 8th day?
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's about relationship building, and we are seeing people starting to return more frequently now. You know, we're starting to develop relationships with people. Some people we know are coming in every day and we know roughly when they'll be in, but we're starting to see people come back on a more regular basis. What we have to do is prove ourselves to people, you know. We really have to prove to people that it's a safe place, they can trust us. And I think even that response to the medical emergencies, making sure we're doing that in a manner that doesn't put people off returning has proven really successful. And again, it becomes about your reputation and your credibility within the local community, and the word getting out there to people saying, well, actually, I've been a few times now. You know, having the shower, encouraging people to use the wider parts of the service, but actually some of the work we've been doing around referrals and listening to people and asking what they want from us as a service, you know, speaking to people and saying what is it that's going to make this more useful. So the plan we have is that we'll be constantly evolving and changing to meet the needs of the people that are coming through the door, and it's very much about people's agenda when they come in, as opposed to us setting the agenda. It's been able to listen. And again, as we said, you know, a lot of the people we're working with have got a real mistrust of services. They've not had good experiences in the past. So it's up to us to prove that that's very different. And so far, that seems to be working.
Yeah, and if I can just supplement that by saying that we do have a number of individuals who are, if you like, the early adopters. So they are coming on a regular basis, not just once a week, but much more frequently than that. And there are, as you say, others who are coming twice a week or who have used once and will go away. Some of that is actually about the dynamic nature of their own situation. It's not just about the engagement with the service. So, for example, there will be some people who don't use as regularly as others. So we have to understand that there's some people who will be more transient about how they come into the city centre and out again. So all safer consumption facilities across the world experience this, that they actually are used by a large population, but there's a core population that uses it much more frequently. But I think your question is really important and relevant, because I think we will achieve the public health and recovery benefits most if as many people who are injecting around this facility and into the city centre use this for as many of their injecting episodes as possible. And so our outreach teams, our third sector partners, they've been really, really important, and will continue to work on that. And I think over time, you know, that trend should go in the right direction. But we are keeping an eye on the frequency of use as well. You're quite right.
Could I come in just again very briefly? I'm sorry, just to follow up from both my colleagues' points. I think the information we presented when you visited was probably from about a week and a half ago, and we can already see that gap changing quite significantly, actually. So you may remember that there was a couple of days that were outliers in terms of high numbers of presentations, but actually in terms of the numbers now, they are definitely closing. So just in a period probably of a week and a half, 2 weeks, those numbers are starting to follow exactly as Saket and Lynn have said, bearing out that work, I think.
I just come very briefly, Chair, sorry, just in terms of, I know the question specifically about the FISL service itself and obviously trying to engage people to come back more frequently. I think there is a wider point that needs to be considered, and Saket mentioned, I suppose, the transient nature of people who are publicly injecting the city, and they're not just publicly injecting in that location, they're injecting in other locations around the city centre. And I think that makes the case and makes the argument that actually one facility is probably not enough. We need to have a network of facilities working in conjunction with each other to make it as accessible as possible, so that folk who do have that transient nature can navigate between different services that we are providing, because I think that is potentially a barrier to folk coming back more often, because we know when people purchase their drugs, they want to take them as quickly as possible, and if they're in a location in the city that's further away from the FISL centre itself, then we think we've got the location as best as we possibly can for having one, but it's an argument for having a network of facilities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kirstine Sullivan. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming along today. I was really sorry to
missed the visit, but hopefully I'll get there very soon. My question is for yourself, Saket. So the Scottish Government's Health and Social Care Minister has said that the facility aims to reduce drug-related deaths. However, I'm aware that you've also said that you do not expect the facility to in any way reduce the drug-related death picture in Scotland or even in Glasgow. I think you gave us a slightly different view earlier on this morning. However, there does appear to be some conflicting views as to the aims of the Thistle. And I think with Scotland experiencing the highest number of drug-related deaths in Europe, it is really important that we have some clarity around the expectations of whether the Thistle will have a positive impact insofar as reducing drug-related deaths. So if I could ask you if you could clarify to what extent a reduction in drug-related deaths is a rationale for or intended benefit of the facility.
Yeah, happy to try and clear up any confusion. So the evidence base from other parts of the world suggests that for the population that uses such a facility, there is improved health and reduced mortality rates, including reduced drug-related deaths. And we hope that that will be realised for the population that uses the Thistle. However, that population is a relatively small population, even in relation to the population of people who use drugs in Glasgow city centre. In Glasgow City, so we think in Glasgow City there may be over 10,000 people who use drugs, maybe more than 5,000 people who inject drugs, but this service itself is focused on a particular subgroup. The Taking Away the Chaos described it as 400 to 500 individuals at that time, which was 2016. The population may be slightly less than that now, and the situation is very dynamic. So for that population, we hope very much that there'll be a reduction in drug-related deaths. And as I explained, we have seen some emergencies that have been managed in the Thistle that would have almost definitely led to fatalities outside the service. However, if you build on that and trying to get a Glasgow picture, what is the impact of the Thistle service on Glasgow's drug-related death figures and the national drug-related death figures, you're talking about a small population within much larger populations. So it's very difficult on its own to say the facility will reduce Glasgow's figures, but it is a pilot facility with a view to other facilities, as you've heard, potentially coming on board, and I'm very confident that were a number of these facilities to exist, targeted at populations who have the highest rates of harm and drug-related deaths, then you would see a different picture in Glasgow City, and you'd see the impact of figures in Glasgow City and nationally as well, possibly. I don't know if that helps at all.
I think it does in terms of identifying the very specific group that it's aimed at. I guess my follow on from that would be, and you've just touched upon it in the last part you mentioned, is that still the correct focus given the change in the drugs environment? And of course we know that there isn't an inhalation room, and that opens up a whole other set of questions around legislation. But is focusing on a very, very small population who inject, is that where you believe the biggest difference will be made?
Mm-hmm. So the initial proposal did include a smoking stroke inhalation room as well, and we would be very keen to be able to develop an inhalation room in the facility, because you're right, there has been some change within the drug trends in the city, with more cocaine in particular use, which is being used predominantly through inhalation smoking, though there's a lot of injecting in the city still as well. And we continue to see rising cocaine in the drug-related death toxicology picture. So I think on its own it will have an effect, but as part of a wider system of care where this is a touch point for harm reduction for the individuals who use it, but also access to other treatment and care and support, and as part of a system of care where it links people who are currently not engaged in the other protective services that we have in the city. And we've been working on a whole range of others, and happy to talk about them as well. It is an important point of contact for people who are currently very marginalised and not engaged in those. So I think these are important parts of a comprehensive system of care in a city like ours, I think, and there's a lot of international evidence to support their rollout. The most new services in the world do include, and actually some of them are predominantly now, inhalation rooms rather than just injecting spaces as well.
Can I just briefly come in on that point? Is I think in terms of the question, and I think the question was kind of framed as should there be this focus on this facility? But I think it's fair to say that the revenue budget for this is 1.2 million per year. The overall ADP budget in Glasgow is around about 34-35 million, so it is a small part of the wider package of service that we are providing. I think what can be confused here is the wider focus in terms of really navigating something that is ultimately it is controversial. I think safe consumption rooms do cover controversy, and I think that's why there's been such a national focus on it, but it is only a small part of the wider picture in terms of what we're delivering in Glasgow. And I think we've been very clear that the safe consumption room in and of itself, the FISL, is not a silver bullet, but it's been a missing piece of the jigsaw in terms of what we provide in terms of the services in Glasgow. But as has been said, that's not going to be enough. There does have to be a network of these facilities to really make a difference in terms of those national statistics that we're talking about. And we really need to, because Scotland cannot afford to make a difference in terms of the drug-related death statistics. We do have the worst record anywhere in Europe, and the Scottish Government are investing quite significantly in terms of the national mission. We're doing the same in Glasgow, and this is only one small part of the wider picture in terms of that investment.
Thank you for that, and I do appreciate the point that you're making. However, I think such is the concern around this, that people need to know that public money is being spent in the area that's going to have the biggest impact. So I do think it is a valid question to ask, and I'm not sure we can really be looking to networks when we're only a few weeks into a pilot. I think we need to see the real impact and outcomes before we have further discussion on that. My follow-up question was, to what extent does the facility need to reduce drug-related deaths in order to be considered successful? And you have touched on that, but I do think it's really important, because the centre opened in the context of a national discussion around the concern of the very high rates of drug-related deaths. So I do think this is a critical point.
So there's a very comprehensive evaluation in place. The business case for the facility was based on a number of intended outcomes. So one of those was, of course, improved outcomes for people who use the service, including reduced mortality and reduced drug-related deaths. But also remember that it was linked to the outbreak of HIV in this population. So we want to see reduced HIV transmission, reduced bloodborne virus transmissions and treatments as well. We expect to see better physical health, reduced use of acute services and emergency services as well. A touch base for link to wider support, so referrals and uptake of a whole range of services. So already we're seeing people having support for housing, for treatment and care, and links to recovery as well. So there was our case included a case for recovery for people who use the service. And then there's wider elements, which I describe. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I will do just quickly. So that wider community benefit of discarded litter, discarded and visible public injecting, improved social environment, and then the cost benefit argument, the cost effectiveness. So all of these will be measured by the evaluation, and I think we need to take a sort of holistic an overall view of the outcomes as against the business case that was originally proposed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Supplementary, Lynn Jones?
Yeah, it was really just a point of clarification. I think when I visited the facility, the quote yearly cost was 2.4 million. Is it 2.4 million or is it 1.4 million? Just for clarity for the committee, please.
2.3.
2.3, sorry.
2.3 million pounds per year for the facility. Okay, thank you.
And moving on to Elaine Stewart. Elaine.
Is it clear your understanding what types of drugs are being consumed in the pilot facility? Because you'd said about the cocaine use as a rising trend. So has it surprised you what's been happening or what drugs have been consumed?
Our initial experience, I'll start and again others will follow. So it's an injecting facility, so people, and we're not drug checking, so our information is based on what service users tell us that they are using. What we were surprised by initially was just the volume of cocaine in relation to the heroin. We expected roughly equal amounts of presentations for cocaine and heroin use. But actually in recent week what we've seen is a much more equalization. So we've seen increasing amounts of heroin use within the facility and heroin and cocaine use in snowballing within the facility. And we're getting, I think, a much more a picture that we initially anticipated. We're not seeing people describe any other drugs that they're using in the facility, but of course, we can't be definitive about that because, we don't have drug checking to confirm what is in the samples or not.
Lynn Jones is next.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we've all heard that drug consumption trends are shifting. For example, through the increase in cocaine consumption. Is the facility equipped to keep up with the evolving drug consumption trends in Glasgow?
So I would suggest at the moment, yes we are. I think the evolving drug use across Scotland, across Glasgow, across the world is something that we all need to be constantly watching. We need to constantly think as services how we evolve and change to meet the needs of people that are coming through the door based on what they're using. So that's not just local to this, that's our whole service, but we've developed a number of treatment options, not just medication for people, moving forward. We've got a cocaine toolkit that we've launched within Glasgow that we're using, we're rolling that out. We think about how we manage people's benzodiazepine use, and again it's linked into the wider system of care. It's about how we access other parts of service via the Thistle as an entry point for that. So I think it's something that will constantly develop and constantly evolve, and we need to monitor. We do have a strong training plan in place for staff. We've got support from our psychologists. We work close with Scottish Drugs Forum, who provide a lot of the training for us, and we're constantly looking at that and reviewing it, and we'll continue to monitor it.
So if I can just come in quickly there. Clearly, we are not able to provide an inhalation space because we know that has been possibly the major shift in the last 3-4 years in particular. So at this moment in time, we're hearing from current service users and other people who would use this service and the partner services that work with them, that if we had an inhalation space, then some people would use that space. On top of the other sort of obvious public health concern in the city has been around whether synthetic opioids become part of the drugs traded in the street. So we have data from the last 2-3 years which tells us that actually nitazines and certainly fentanyl, but fentanyl we haven't really seen many at all, but nitazines we've seen very small numbers, but year on year maybe small numbers increase. And so we think that if people are going to be using nitazines and injecting nitazines in this environment, would probably be the best and safest environment to do that if people were to do that, because nitazines are very potent opioids, as you know, and could potentially be involved in very significant overdoses and deaths. However, to assist us in further, as well as an inhalation space, we hope to have a drug checking service and a facility on site in due course as well. And that will help us understand better what the drug trends in the city are, what people are actually using in the facility, if they're able to get those checked. And that will help us develop the service and make it even more fit for purpose than it is at the moment.
Just on that point, in terms of drug checking, I think it is crucial in terms of quickly responding to dangerous or contaminated drugs as well. I think many will have seen the kind of warnings that came out from an NHS board in Scotland earlier this week in terms of contaminated drugs. And how quickly drug checking could actually address some, not address, but put out warnings to citizens in the city. So I think it is really crucial that obviously the application's in with the Home Office at this point in time, but I really hope that they can look at it with a matter of urgency given the change in drug trends, given the dangers of contaminated drugs in the system, and hopefully we can kind of make real progress in kind of getting that opened. There's a couple of, I suppose, practical issues in terms of the delivery of the service as well. The Misuse of Drugs Act prohibits us from giving people using the service tourniquets, for instance, and the other obvious thing, if we're looking at inhalation, is providing equipment for smoking, so pipes, for instance. So I think that's two areas that the UK government potentially have to look at as well in terms of providing exemptions for us to really assist those who are using the service and indeed want to reduce harm by moving away from intravenous injecting into inhalation as well, in terms of giving out pipes as well.
Yep. So Turning Point has raised concern that the facility is already outdated and offers little in the way of support for the growing number of people who inhale drugs or use drugs other than heroin. And an addiction campaigner, Anne-Marie Ward, has voiced her opposition to the suggestion that smoking laws may be altered to allow an inhalation room at the Thistle. She then went on and she's described the suggestion that we should change these laws to encourage people to stop injecting and return to smoking cocaine as misguided and disconnected from the reality of addiction. To what extent would you agree with that characterisation from both Turning Point and Anne-Marie Ward?
In terms of the latter point, I'm happy to kind of address some of those points. I mean, I think that statement would go against all evidence that is available in terms of reducing harm, and I don't think that's a position that we certainly would recognise in terms of the journey through the service. In terms of Turning Point Scotland's point, I think it's a fair observation that the facility does lack, obviously, that inhalation space, and it's something that we really need to start working quickly on to make that case to allow an exemption and legislation, and I think we need to navigate ourselves through the different types of legislation that are required to make that difference. We have already raised the issue informally and verbally with Scottish Government and Government Ministers, and we are in the process, I think, of preparing a case to put to Government to try and see if there is exemptions within the legislation that would allow us to create that inhalation space. As has been previously said, we have developed the facility in terms of the physical aspect of it that can be retrofitted to allow for inhalation, because we know through all of the discussions that we've had with our international peer other consumption rooms that inhalation is a really crucial part of the harm reduction service that they provide. So we were really keen to, obviously, to model our service on that best international practice, and that's a case that we will make to Scottish Government in the near future.
Okay. Anne-Marie Ward goes on to say that her comment reflects fundamental ignorance of the progression of the condition and the nature of addiction. And for someone who's progressed to injecting drugs, the likelihood of them willingly switching to smoking is so rare that it's akin to finding hen's teeth. So just on that basis, to what extent is the facility designed for or intended to reach people who inject drugs multiple times throughout the day?
Yeah, so look, the purpose of an inhalation room would be to engage people who are currently involved in smoking, inhaling drugs, often in outdoor spaces at the moment, and people who aren't engaged in harm reduction and treatment and care and recovery supports. So that would be one of the key aims of having an inhalation room, just as it is for providing a safer injecting space as well. The other around route transition, which is, I think, what is being described or mischaracterized there, is that inhalation is probably a safer and less harmful way of consuming drugs if people want to do it compared to injecting. And we're seeing, really, for cocaine users, we're seeing appalling harm, physical harm, particularly in relation to injecting wounds. And so if we can support people away from that injecting behaviour into a safer route of using when they are not at this moment ready to stop using those drugs, then I think that is a positive health intervention. And actually that's a very well established health intervention beyond our discussion here. It's what's very common practice in Europe and in other parts of the world. As far as that sort of wider sort of comment is concerned, I think I have to say I think those are relatively fringe or extreme thoughts in our field. Almost everybody who works with this population in a meaningful way runs services, supports this population. A lot of the lived experience groups who are involved in our work, the recovery communities, they understand the rationale very differently to one that's being described there, and they understand the links that this service may provide for people who are very marginalised and distant from recovery to an improved quality of life and potentially onto recovery as well. So that view is not just held by professionals and academics, but it's actually held by people who work day in and out with this population and many people who have lived experience of recovery. And we employ people with lived experience of recovery who would absolutely counter that depiction of the service.
Can I just add quickly as well? I think one of the benefits of a service like the Thistle, and as Saket spoke about, people not being at that stage where they want to look at the next stage of recovery, if you like. It's about engagement, it's about relationship building. So this is about people coming in and beginning to feel comfortable talking about what is happening in their life. If that leads to somebody saying, I want to access a residential service or I want to access care and treatment services, as we have seen, we would support that and we would absolutely encourage that if that's what people are telling us that we want. I think a lot of the people we're seeing are a long way away from being ready to take that next step of going into, for example, a rehab. So if that's what people come in and tell us they want, we can support them and we can support them in that road. But it's a huge amount of work, and are people ready for that at a point where they're injecting 10, 12 times a day? Possibly that's too big a leap. So there needs to be a stepped approach to that for people, and it's just making people feel comfortable that they can go at their own pace.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Could I just check, Councillor Casey, you mentioned about the licence for or the application for the licence for checking drugs. Has there been any feedback about when you might get a decision on that from the Home Office as yet?
I don't believe that we've got any kind of definitive dates. There has been some, so there has to be a visit, a kind of compliance visit that the Home Office carry out. And I think there's been several dates put in the diary and those have been cancelled, not at our end. So hopefully the Home Office can obviously get a definitive date in the diary to come and do that compliance visit, and then we can obviously hopefully progress the licence itself. I don't know if any colleagues have got any further information on that, because that was the information I had last week.
No, it's same information, but I think it is important to say for Glasgow, so there's 3 sites across the country that wish to pilot drug checking. Because we have a Home Office licence already in place in terms of our enhanced drug treatment service, it's actually an addition, so it's a change to our licence. And as Councillor Casey said, we're still awaiting confirmation of visit to renew that licence.
Okay,
I would just add very quickly, we do have regular compliance visits because of the existing licence, and there have been cancellations in the past, so it's not something that particularly has concerned us from that perspective.
Thank you. Maureen Burke.
Thank you, Chair. I think my colleagues touched on this just previously, so if I can maybe just ask a few follow-ups from that about the inhalation room. Just to ask, what legal exemptions would be needed to open the inhalation room? And just on the back of that, why has the Scottish Government not provided the necessary legal exemptions to the devolved legislation? Allan, I don't know if it's yourself or maybe Saket that wants to respond.
I can start, and I'll start this the kind of second point. I think in terms of Scottish Government, why have they not? It's because we've not made that formal request to them yet. So it's not like the Scottish Government have said no to that. They've not obviously said yes yet. We need to obviously present them with a specific case. I think Saket might be able to go into the history a wee bit in terms of his inhalation was on the initial proposal to the previous Lord Advocate, but they had obviously said no to the overall service at that point in time. But I think it's fair to say that while we build that case, Scottish Government haven't made any decision one way or the other in terms of allowing that exemption. But in terms of the other points, I don't know if any of my other colleagues want to kind of say in terms of what specific exemptions would be required.
Yeah, so this is where you realise I'm not a lawyer, so I won't be able to give you sort of the definitive. But my understanding is that there would be exemptions under some of the Scottish Government, the devolved smoking legislations that would allow us to be an exempt premises for certain acts related to, I think, the Smoking Health Act. So we're delighted that we're going to hopefully be able to make a case for that soon, because we're hearing already that that's a important intervention that service users would potentially use, would definitely use. Just a little bit on the background on this. There were though other restraints as well. So one of those was around the building and the ventilation requirements for inhalation rooms. We weren't sure whether we would have space in the footprint of this facility to be able to implement a inhalation room. And also when we looked at the potential ventilation required, it was very sort of high-grade ventilation that we might not be able to source. But what's happened in the implementation of this facility, actually we're confident that we would be able to find some space within the facility. And because we had to explore ventilation for the using space itself, the injecting booths themselves, we made the decision to actually put the ventilation in that would be fit for purpose should we be able to progress to an inhalation space in due course. So some of the conditions required for us are now much more advanced and ready than we thought they would be even 6 months, 8 months ago.
I'll come back just quickly. So again, I suppose picking up on one of Councillor Casey's earlier points around the Misuse of Drugs Act. So in terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act, as you know, it prohibits the supply of certain equipment. And I think if we were considering inhalation rooms, we would also need to consider that in terms of the equipment that would, if you're running a service, as we have found with tourniquets, we would definitely be wanting to make a case around supplying pipes, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Before I move on to Susan, I think we could sit and talk to you all day about this, quite honestly, because our private discussion was going in that direction. But I'm very, very conscious of time, and we want to make sure that we cover the range of issues. So if I could just ask colleagues and witnesses to be as succinct as they possibly can be. Susan Murray.
Thank you very much. So this is really a question for all of you. Apologies, Chair. But we know that the safer drug consumption rooms work best when there is a system of support roundabout in the community. Do you feel that Glasgow has got that system of support in the community there already existing?
Do you want me to pick up that? So, as briefly as possible, yes, absolutely. And I think colleagues have talked very clearly about the full range of harm reduction, treatment and care and recovery services that are available across the city. As Councillor Casey highlighted, that's in terms of the budget for that across alcohol and drug recovery services. That's just over 34 million, and that is across all of those range of services. So it's really important that we are able to offer, and aligned with obviously the national mission and the medicated assisted treatment standards, same-day treatment, choice of treatment, you know, where people require that, but also the wider supports, as Lynn had highlighted. Actually, if somebody's in the service and wants access to residential rehab, we would assess them for that. I think that that's not going to be the case for the majority of people, given the stage in terms of their recovery. But the business case absolutely outlined this service should aim to look at people's recovery. And as you'll know, recovery is different for different people, and it is about those wider supports. I think the really important aspect of this service, and we spent a long time looking at the workforce and the skill mix and ensuring that we had a range of staff, including people with lived experience, a range of staff to look at a much more holistic view of people as they come in the door, you know, so not just the injecting. The injecting is important, but that's actually not the most important part of somebody's visit to that service, and it is about that linking, and we've got a number of examples already of people, for example, finding, you know, staff supporting people to find accommodation, staff supporting people into treatment and care services, and that's really important. So I mean, I do think that we've got a wide range of services covering all of the, you know, all of the harm reduction, treatment and recovery services in the communities.
It's for 3 years and it's funded for 3 years. Do you know about the funding for the wraparound services? Because I mean, it's significant amounts of money going into this, and are you confident that that money is going to continue to be available to support them?
So the money that funds our alcohol and drug recovery services, and also the wider third sector, because we've had a huge number of wide third sector partners who support that agenda as well, is funded through a range of funding streams, from directly from government and through the national mission. I think it's important to say that since 2021 we have increased so in terms of spend on alcohol and drug recovery services, we have increased that by 2.6 million, and that's absolutely in recognition of the increase in access to treatment and care that's required. Some of that has came from national mission monies, but it's all aligned to the national strategy.
I would say with the Thistle being part of alcohol and drug recovery services in Glasgow, what we have done is taken away those barriers into other services. So for example, for us to refer in for care and treatment, we don't have to complete forms, we don't have to send away forms, we phone our colleagues in the appropriate locality and that's there. We have our own inpatient beds, we have a crisis outreach there. So we have 7-day services that are there to do that wraparound.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, Chair, but I just need to make a small addition to that, which is that it's not all about alcohol and drug recovery services. We need wider wraparound supports for this population. So we're very lucky to be co-located with Housing First officers. We have a bloodborne virus team from acute services and sexual reproductive health services on site as well. So, and we hope to have primary care services on site as well. And those aren't dependent, they will exist whether the Thistle is there or not. They're very excited about the Thistle because it gives them access to a patient group that they really feel are very vulnerable and they want to work with. So for example, the bloodborne virus team has already instigated an on-site a clinic within the Thistle so that they can engage with new diagnoses of HIV or hepatitis C should they arise.
Yeah.
You'll be glad to know that my colleagues have covered everything, I think.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, certainly from the visit and from speaking to your people with lived experience, it's really good to hear how this approach is working. Is there any one particular service that is being you know, the need for it is being highlighted by you being able to reach this disadvantaged group. Is there any one particular service that sort of sticks out as being that is needed?
In terms of service support that we need outside the multidisciplinary team of the Thistle, the most obvious one is housing.
Right.
Yeah, the most obvious one is accommodation.
Housing and welfare rights, I think, are fair to say, aren't they, in terms of our highest referrals out with the service.
And just in terms of that housing issue, Glasgow did declare housing emergency because of the acute pressures that we're facing. It's a whole other issue that I'm sure you won't want to get into today, but the pressures being faced in the city in terms of folk who are coming from other parts of the UK as well into Glasgow because of specific legislation in England and Wales is causing really acute pressure in terms of our housing support services. So that is probably one of the fundamental challenges that we're facing just now.
Just it's a final comment to say that, you know, I think you're doing fantastic work. I think that the way that you're able to reach this hard to reach group is such a key lesson that we should be trying to extend for other areas.
The committee, of course, will come to a conclusion about that at a later point, but members are welcome to make their individual comments. I've got a quick supplementary from Maureen Burke.
Just on the housing issue, I think it's great what you're doing, but just to see, in my experience, I've heard people saying that people that are drug related, you know, that they don't want housing. Are you finding that some people don't want to be rehoused, or is there an uptake on people that want to actually make a difference and get into housing?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that there has already been housing referrals that have taken place within the facility, so we've already seen that clear pathway of folk coming into the service who have maybe had issues with tenancy sustainment or indeed other issues in terms of getting accommodation, and that has happened, so that journey's already been there. I'm not aware specifically of anybody who's been using the service who has kind of refused accommodation or anything like that. There is individuals who are in the city of Glasgow who do refuse accommodation support, and I think that would be the case probably across the UK and especially in some of our big population areas. But I'm not aware that that's specific to any of the services that we're having at the Thistle.
I would say it's less that people don't want housing and more that maybe their previous experience of their accommodation has not met their needs. You know, perhaps it's been in an area where they've not felt safe, or, you know, some of the people we know that sleep out with their homes, they have home addresses but they're not there. It's because they don't feel safe in that area. So that's some of the work we are then able to do with our colleagues in housing to work around how we give that person a safe tenancy where they feel safe and they're supported as well. And I think my concern is that sometimes if they've not been housed for such a long time, how they cope with what they've got to do when they get housed. And that's, you know, it's that rapid and support. They need that further support to make sure that they get that, you know, and that they are able to eventually have their own home and live in it. So thank you for that.
Could I maybe just very quickly say, so just that housing first approach, because that's not unique to Glasgow, obviously that's an approach. I mean, we have a housing first team, but that approach is really critical to exactly the points you've made, both for, you know, people to engage with supports and maintain a house when you've not lived in a house, but also from neighbours and the community around about. And we need to acknowledge that sometimes, you know, so I think that's really important.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Christine Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to my earlier point about the impactful use of public funding. And I think it is an important point to remember, because behind every related death is a family that's in mourning who've been devastated. So we need to make sure that our resources are targeted in the right way. Professor Matheson has said, as we've referenced, that Thistle is a gold standard facility. Is this gold standard the most cost-effective use of funding, or do you think there are other alternative formats that could offer similar harm reduction benefits at a lower cost?
I mean, I think all of us will probably have a response to this, and I'm probably the non-medical or non-clinician here, so I've certainly got a view. I think first and foremost, the Thistle, in terms of the level of service there, is the right one. For it being the first in the UK, I think we had to be absolutely sure, belt and braces, that we get it absolutely right and we make sure that it does what it should be doing in terms of that service. When you look at models across the world and the globe, they do differ. There's very different models. There is obviously models that are delivered delivered by the kind of third sector. There's models that are community-based and volunteer-run. And I think basically for me, I think we need to look at a different mixture of them. Now, obviously there's going to be a real analysis on the work that we are doing in the Thistle, and that's great. But there's a potential there to look at other types of models. So, for instance, is there something that you could potentially have a mobile service in the city, or indeed in other locations, that maybe reduce those costs associated with it? But I think there is certainly a need for the level of spend at the Thistle, make sure we get that absolutely right and we prove the concept of it. But there's certainly room and scope to look at other models that are available as well.
Thank you. I think you've answered my question on that point, because I was going to ask about mobile units. So, but can I just finally ask, to what extent is the cost of running a gold standard facility sustainable beyond the current 3-year pilot, given the state of local government funding at the moment?
Okay, can I
yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's fair to say it is a pilot at the moment, and we will obviously, as part of any pilot across the country for any health and social care service, we would review as part of that pilot the costs and the cost effectiveness of that service, and we'll continue to do that. So whilst the evaluation will look at the wider impact and the issues that we've discussed today, as an HSCP, as a Health and Social Care Partnership, and as an IGIB, obviously we will need to review that and look at that model moving forward. I do think, though, and I would have to say this, I feel compelled to say this, that I think we should be aiming for gold standard services, whatever services we deliver across NHS and across social care. And I think this is a service that, you know, is held up, it is multidisciplinary, but it is aimed at that much wider agenda. So this, as I've said before, and I won't repeat myself, on the basis of time, but this isn't just about people coming in and injecting. This is about linking people, and particularly individuals who've been a harder to reach population. And in terms of cost effectiveness, as we've talked about, there has been a number of medical emergencies that I fully believe, had they happened out with the service, would have resulted in fatality. And I think that's what we need to remember. And I know that that's, you know, in terms of cost effectiveness, is managed across a wide range of issues, such as ED presentations, acute hospital inpatient bed days, all of that will be picked up in the evaluation.
Thank you.
Can I make one final comment on this? I'm
Very
really,
briefly, please,
I'm really
Dr.
sorry.
Saket.
I think the cost discussion is very interesting, but you have to sort of have it in the context of the emergency around drug-related deaths. When you have more than 1,000 drug-related deaths in a country the size of Scotland, when the burden of disease from drug misuse is as high in Scotland as it is, it's not normal compared to lots of other parts of the world. So we have a specific situation which needs an emergency response, and the response needs to be commensurate with the level of the problem. So I think the question is not so much how do we justify spending this, it's a question of how do we justify not doing more and more. And it's not just about the drug consumption facility, it's about a whole range of services. So Lynn has been managing the crisis outreach services, which has been developing an outreach near fatal overdose response. We've been implementing MAT standards, we've increased our residential services, including stabilisation, crisis and rehab. So we want to build as much of a system of care as possible with multiple points of entry for people to reduce harms and improve the quality of life for them, and hopefully move on to recovery as well. So I think I very much would argue that we continue with a gold standard model in the long run, and that we recognise that that is actually fit for purpose when you have the level of harm and public health crisis that is going on at the moment.
Just want to say, in terms of the other models that I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not gold standard, they're just different types of models. Because the third sector deliver it doesn't mean it wouldn't be that high class gold standard either.
Yeah, thanks. I think my main point was where the funding is going to have the biggest impact. because I think everybody knows that public services are under the cosh when it comes to finances at the moment. So it's about the impact where that is likely to be. So I'm happy with the answer you've given. Thank you.
Okay, we have a supplementary from Elaine Stewart.
In the back of it, Kirsten was saying about gold standard, and we all know trends move and government's funding moves in different directions. What would happen if the Scottish Government withdrew that funding? Where would the sustainability of the facility be? Would it be on Glasgow City Council?
We take that. So, in essence, that would come back to the Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership and the IGIB. And again, with any other funding withdrawal or any funding reduction, we would need to work up a model around how to manage that service, should we manage that service, and how that fitted into the wider alcohol and drug recovery services.
Elaine, I think you're rostered next, so if you want to carry on with your own question.
Well, I think they've basically answered majority what I was going to ask, and that was about the legal framework and what the limitations might be. In what way do you think the new Lord Advocate taking office would be a different approach for the previous? Has it been a different approach?
So I think it's fair to say that the case that we made to the new Lord Advocate was different. It was more specific and it was more detailed. That's not to say, though, that offer wasn't made to the previous Lord Advocate. Certainly I had correspondence with the previous Lord Advocate to say that we would be more than happy to make a more detailed case with those site specifications, standard operating procedures, etc. Unfortunately, that Lord Advocate had taken a legal opinion, a legal view on the situation. It was refreshing and welcome that when the new Lord Advocate came in, they had indicated that they would be willing to look at a fresh approach and a fresh case. But I suppose that question creates a fundamental problem, I think, in the way in which we progress forward, because the fragility of a safe consumption room, in my opinion, shouldn't be based on the opinion or the view of one individual person in post. And I think that is a potential problem moving forward. And I think that makes a case and makes the argument, actually, to have a sustainable framework in terms of how safe consumption rooms can continue into the future and indeed can expand, really does require, and it's been our opinion all the way through this, even when we got the exemption of prosecution policy, but the most sustainable way to continue safe consumption rooms is an explicit change in the Misuse of Drugs Act to allow for safe consumption rooms to operate. Now, I would go for. I mean, I think that clearly you maybe know my politics, but I think the laws around the Misuse of Drugs Act, if the UK Government aren't wanting to amend them or change them, I think it should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament and the other devolved administrations to look at their own bespoke issues, because every part of the UK has got different specific problems, and I think it's something that we should be doing in terms of that at a local level. But as I say, the question kind of points out the fragility of that position, that one person ultimately has the responsibility of whether or not the facility either gets a go-ahead or continues in the future.
And I think the concern would possibly be that if there were to be another Lord Advocate who perhaps took another view, that it still would leave you in a very difficult position. But we'll move on. Susan Murray.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Susan.
Yeah, no, you've caught me on the hop. Sorry. Right. Apologies, folks. Right. So the UK Government has said it won't interfere with the Lord Advocate's position regarding the pilot. But what powers does the UK Government have to interfere with the site's operation if it was inclined to? Do you think that the UK Government could close the Thistle if it wanted to?
Certainly from my perspective, I think I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that question just on the basis that it's a legal question, and I would want to defer that to people who are in a position to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question to ask. I think in terms of the UK Government's formal position on this currently, as I say, I welcomed that announcement that they weren't going to intervene. and they respected the kind of the Lord Advocate's position. It's certainly my hope that that position would continue, and obviously part of the work that we're doing is a proper evaluation of the site. I think there would obviously be a lot of legal wrangling between both Scottish Government and UK Government regarding any intervention that would potentially happen. But again, as Kelda said, that's not for us to determine. We'll operate as best we possibly can under the current situation. But the Lord Advocate's guidance and position is very, very clear, and there's obviously a separation of laws in Scotland to the rest of the UK, and the UK Government have respected that. But yeah, I would certainly hope that would not be the case in the future.
So my next question is sort of a similar nature, but do you support the decision not to establish an exclusion zone around the pilot facility? And, round about what the implications are of encouraging people to use the facility when effectively there might be no way of getting them there while they're carrying an illegal substance, which they intend to consume, but to get there then without prosecution.
So, just in terms of that, I mean, there's a couple of points in there. Glasgow City Council has formally taken the position of supporting decriminalisation of drug possession for personal use. So that would be my fundamental point is moving forward. I would hope that the Misuse of Drugs Act is amended to allow decriminalisation in terms of that, which would address the concerns that you're raising in terms of that. In terms of, I think it was the decision to not have an exclusion zone around the facility is right because any other issues, and I think the community were concerned about that, whether or not there'd be rising antisocial behaviour and all of the other associated problems with that. Police Scotland have, for a number of years, been taking a public health approach to policing when it comes to drugs, and I think that's certainly a move in the right direction. Obviously, Police Scotland largely now carrying the locks on it, for instance, and that's something that is really, really welcome. But they've been very, very clear that the policing around the facility will not change. They will not be stopping people simply accessing the facility unless there is some other reason to intervene in that process, so another crime or whatever being committed. And I think that's the right approach. And I think on balance, for the local community and indeed for the population who are using the facility itself, that is ultimately the right response to opening the facility, because I think it would potentially send out the wrong message if there was some kind of view that there was an area, a buffer zone around the location, that there was an exemptions in the law, because the law has not changed whatsoever, and I think that needs to be very, very clear. The Lord Advocate's public prosecution policy is around about possession for use within the facility itself.
And does that affect, do you think, the numbers that come to the facility because of the perceived risk from users at all?
I think it's hard to tell at this point in time, and that's certainly something that we'll be looking at in terms of the engagement with service users who are coming to the facility, and I hope that we can find a way to engage with folk who are not using the facility as well, and that's certainly something that we'll be deeply diving into in terms of why there's barriers to accessing it. I think as Kelda said in our evidence, the numbers increasing week on week, I think, shows a bit of confidence that there isn't those issues, that are those worries that people had maybe initially had imagined would be the case. So there is confidence growing in the service that is not the case. And as I say, the relationship between us and Police Scotland has been really, really beneficial in terms of the delivery of that position as well.
You're going to come in, can I come in?
Yeah, you go.
It's probably just quickly to say that it is important to note that we did not, as an HSEP and in terms of our business case and our ask of the Lord Advocate in terms of the prosecution policy, we did not ask for an exclusion zone, so it wasn't a decision made by the Lord Advocate necessarily. And I think it is important, exactly as Allan has said, there is a bit, in terms of our community engagement, there is a bit of confidence around that. I think I would say very clearly people are publicly injecting anyway within a fairly close proximity to the service, and therefore, they will be in possession of drugs, wherever they are within that vicinity. So that doesn't really change. I do think there is a trust in the service, and to make sure, and again, as Councillor Casey has pointed out, that is increasing, and therefore we can see that trust hopefully is building in that community of people.
Thank you.
Move to Douglas McAllister now, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. You're obviously part of a 3-year pilot scheme. Will you consider asking the Lord Advocate for an extension on the statement of the prosecution policy?
To answer that. So I think it's difficult to say at this stage, because I think what we would need to say is that would be absolutely predicated on the hopefully success of the facility and where we were at that point. I think as colleagues have highlighted, we would continue to argue very much that a change in the primary legislation, or indeed devolving of that primary legislation, would be the most appropriate option in terms of continuing a long-term the long-term sustainability, but the service is sustainable in its current form with the current prosecution policy. So I know I've kind of avoided that question, but I think for me as an organisation we would be saying that we would need to wait until nearer the time to look at, but we are continuing to engage with Crown Office, and Crown Office are obviously interested in terms of the facility, as Councillor Casey has said, work very closely with Police Scotland as well.
I need to double check this, but my understanding is that there isn't an expiry date on the statement of prosecution policy. The 3-year pilot is in terms of the funding from Scottish Government in terms of that, but I don't understand that there is an expiry date on the prosecution policy, but I maybe...
That's my understanding.
The Lord Advocate certainly talked about the pilot, whether officially, legally, that means there's an expiry date, I'm not sure.
I presume they go hand in hand.
Yeah, I would think so.
Certainly I don't remember when you flashed up on the screen the letter from the Lord Advocate that it had a line that said, and you must close at such and such point or after the pilot, but I suppose it makes sense for it to be valid for the period of the pilot. Okay, thank you very much. I think we've now exhausted all our questions, so I hope we haven't exhausted you in the process. But thank you very much for coming along. Sorry we had to push it a little bit at the end, but we have Scottish questions this morning which some people will be very anxious to get to. So thank you again for coming down. Thank you again for allowing us to come to the facility. And would you please pass on our thanks also to the lived experience group that we met when we were there, for spending time. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.